How's it going, everybody? This is Cameron White with White Light Astrology, giving you guys your July 2019 horoscope for Virgo, Sun, and Rising. Thank you guys so much for being here and liking and sharing and commenting and subscribing. I love and appreciate every single one of you guys. And before we begin, I just wanted to mention that, we're finally here in July. We've been talking about this since January. This is probably the most intense and crazy month of this year. But the one thing I wanted to hit on is the things that are going to be coming up this month are really important. And they're planting seeds for us to grow into a very awesome August and September. So while there is going to be some change and some fast things going on this month as we go into August and September, things are looking a lot better. So get through this month. You guys can do it. And you already know shit's coming up anyway. It's just time to do it, time to handle it so we can move on. So we're starting July off on, I keep saying Mars first. On July 1st, we have Mars ingressing into Leo, and it's leaving your 11th house of friendships and groups and collective endeavors, and is moving into the 12th house of repressed parts of yourself, unacknowledged parts of yourself, hidden things, the subconscious, hidden enemies, stuff you don't always see what's going on, and it has to do a lot more of an internalized part of you. Now, Mars is the planet of our action, our drive, our intentions, how we're doing things, why we're doing them. And Mars is also a malefic planet, so it heats things up, it severs and it cuts and it makes things hot and dry. Now, as Mars is moving into Leo, it's getting out of its sign of fall and going into the sign of Leo, which isn't its domicile or exaltation or anything like that, but it's pretty healthy there. And Leo is all about, of course, our identity. This has to do with our light, our vibe. This has to deal with being authentic and in integrity. Leo sometimes deals with egotistical things, as well as, oh my god, I can't figure out the word I just wanted to use right now. But yeah, you guys get what I'm saying. Anyway, as Mars goes into Leo, this is where Mars is kind of like wanting to act out a little bit more passionately and sometimes egotistically at times and a little bit brash. And so this is going to be a big time to really make sure that you're keeping your cool. But as Mars goes through your 12th house, and Mars being this planet of frustrations and anger in this area of the subconscious and repressed parts of yourself, it can be really easy to get frustrated with certain things and not necessarily know where or why or where they're coming from or why you are upset or why you are angry. But the next day on July 2nd, that's when we're going to be having the solar eclipse in Cancer, and this is super duper important because this is typically the new moon in Cancer, but because in eclipse it's not. Eclipses are when there's usually supposed to be light and then that light gets blocked out by the sun or the moon or earth. Now with this happening in Cancer, where we've been focusing on, for you guys specifically, attending to the needs of not only friendships, but collective endeavors, groups of people you've been wanting to feel more connected, more entrusted, more protective and nurtured in that area. And while we have this eclipse in Cancer, if you haven't had that emphasis on that part of your life already, this is definitely when that emphasis is going to happen and when you're going to start taking a look and more deeper dive into that area. And then that starts off eclipse season, which means the next 2 weeks are pretty weird. Then on the next day, on July 3rd, that is when we have Venus moving into Cancer, and Venus is getting out of your 10th house where she was able to make some amends and make things a little bit more enjoyable. And now Venus, the planet of love and value, relationships, connection, she's now entering the sign of Cancer, which is about trust. This is about empathy. This is about essentials, and this is about sentimental things. This is about connecting. This is about, being vulnerable and protecting and nurturing. And so as Venus is starting to very much value this expression of being protective, of being nurturing, and she goes into your 11th house of friendships, I think this is definitely going to be where more of your attention and more of your value gets drawn to the connections that you've been making along the way with the North Node being in Cancer. Then on July 8th, that is when Mercury stations retrograde, and Mercury is now in Leo at this point in your 12th house. And Mercury's trying to figure out what's best and what's right. While it's in Leo, it's trying to figure out what's the most authentic, the most expressive, and the most clear way of speaking and communicating. But this is in your 12th house of repressed and unacknowledged parts of yourself. So you're doing a lot of rethinking about yourself and a lot of going, who am I and why do I say these things? And am I being authentic? Am I being integral with this part of myself? And as Mercury stations retrograde, it is also going to be conjoining Mars. And so during this time, you may find, you could just get irritated. Mercury going retrograde in your 12th house is always kind of like what's going on? Like, I have no idea what anything means, and it's just going to be kind of a confusing time. But I want to just bring up that one Mercury station is retrograde and it's conjoining Mars. That may bring up some more inflammatory, side effects. Like there could be a little bit more heat and anger in this. And so it's definitely appropriate to be aware of what that can end up manifesting into. But then about a week and a half, or not a week and a half, but about a week later on July 16th is when we have the lunar eclipse in Capricorn. And this is wrapping up eclipse season, but this is probably the most important lunation of this year. Now, Saturn, South Node, Pluto have been going through your 5th house for quite some time now. This is a lot of deeper work on the things that you want, the things that you enjoy. The 5th house is love, sex, children, creativity, arts, hobbies, music, things like that. Anything. It's an extension of ourselves. It's a trine to the 1st house. It's an extension of who we are and our personality, what makes us unique. And now, as we have this full moon or this lunar eclipse in Capricorn that we're having, the way that you might have structured or the way that you might have dealt with things in this area may not necessarily be so much appropriate for when you're going into, this 11th house stuff of working with other people and, doing what's going to be best for that situation. Also on this eclipse is when Venus is going to oppose Saturn. That's also on July 16th. And so I want to hit on this because as Venus is in Cancer and you're wanting to feel more connected and more trusting and, taking care of more of the relationship that you have with bigger groups of people, whether that's, communities or a friend group or a social endeavor, whatever it is, as Venus is drawing you into that area and finding a lot more value in it, as it opposes Saturn. Saturn in the 5th house is like, it's kind of making it hard to enjoy because there's a certain structure of which you want things to go and that system doesn't necessarily work anymore. And as Venus opposes Saturn, this is kind of like you're not going to get that connection until you let go of the structures and the systems that you've implied all of the fun stuff with already. But why I say that is the next day on July 17th, this is when Venus is going to conjoin the North Node. And this is important because the North Node, of course, is, the dragon's head, Rahu. This is about what we're hungry for, what we're chasing after, what we want to consume. It's kind of like this drive that's in us. And as it's in Cancer, where you're looking for more of a connection in that group of people, Venus conjoining the North Node is really getting more hungry and having more of that desire to go in that direction and being like, you know what, this is what I'm feeling, this is what I want, I do want to take care of this, and I'm willing to do what it takes to get there. And even though when Venus opposes Saturn, it's going to be kind of like, a little bit deeper than you expected, it's really important to realize that the old way of doing things not necessarily doesn't work, but it did work at one point. It's just about you can't do the same thing over and over again and expect the different results. But then on July 19th, Mercury retrogresses back into Cancer. And so while Mercury was in your 12th house trying to figure out, who are you? Why do you say things? Who is you? And what's the most authentic way to express and be that? As Mercury goes back into Cancer in the 11th house, I think this is important because Mercury, the messenger, the communicator, going into the sign of, again, trust and empathy and relations. This is your 11th house of friendship. So I think this is kind of going back down to, okay, who am I connected with and who do I surround myself with? What does that look like? How can I trust more of these people and console with them almost in a sense? But then 3 days later on July 21st is when Mercury goes Cazimi with the sun. That is when it is right in between the earth and the sun and it conjoins it. This is in essence when Mercury gets purified by fire, when things can start to be a lot more clear and make a lot more sense. And as Mercury goes Cazimi with the sun at like those last couple degrees of Cancer, this is kind of like, hey, maybe you need to realize who you've been connecting yourself to that may be influencing more of your identity and who you are and kind of realize, what serves and what doesn't. But then as we move on into July 23rd, that is when the sun will enter Leo. The sun will be going into your 12th house of, again, hidden areas, isolation, repressed parts of yourself, the subconscious. And as the sun, the main luminary, is going into its sign of domicile, Leo, and transiting your 12th house, this is bringing a lot of light and attention to this part of you, going, not necessarily like who are you, like you have to question your whole life or anything like that. But I think this is just about growing and evolving and, again, becoming more authentic and more integral with who you are by kind of coming it, like Virgo is so perfectionist, like that's kind of like the, what everyone kind of says. And I think that's somewhat true, and a lot of it, I think, comes from the idea that Leo has to do with doing things grand and doing things big and loud, while Virgo is more about the tactical things, like the practicality, the execution of it. And so at the same time, it can be easy to get caught up in the how to do things rather than the feeling it takes to actually do the things themselves. But then on July 24th, that is when Mercury conjoins Venus, and this is also really important because while Venus is in Cancer in your 11th house, this is bringing better connections and relationships through friendships. Mercury conjoining Venus is kind of like Mercury getting a nice talk with Venus, and while Mercury in Cancer is still retrograde and still a little bit confused on logically applying how its emotions feel, Mercury conjoining Venus is like, hey, but it's okay to like express empathy and to be vulnerable and to trust and to have the communication and that you need to, maybe with your friends, or maybe it is with if this has your midheaven in the 11th house and it's in Cancer, then this has to do with, career stuff too. But then on July 28th, that is when Venus moves into Leo, and as Venus, of course, the planet of love and expression, goes into the sign of Leo, which is like very grand, very loud. Venus is looking for attention. She's looking for glamour. Venus wants to feel something. Venus wants to be passionate, and Venus wants to live life and not necessarily always make it about Venus, but basically, in essence, make it about Venus. But as Venus goes into your 12th house, where we are dealing with isolation, we are dealing with repressed parts of ourselves, the subconscious and X, Y, and Z, I think this is about kind of being internal about realizing like, hey, you have a lot more worth and a lot more power and a lot more exuberance to put out there, but you've got to realize that first before you can go out and put it everywhere. And I think while Venus is in Leo, transiting your 12th, I think this is just a really big time to bring more of that Leo type attention and energy to yourself. Then we end the month on July 31st with the new moon in Leo. And so at this point, we'll have Mars, the Sun, the Moon, and Venus, and then eventually Mercury will go into Leo too. And while all of these planets are in Leo, I think this is about reimagining yourself in a bigger light and finally starting to express more of that. And this new moon is kind of just about getting clear on what that looks like. And with that being said, thank you guys so much for being here and liking and sharing and commenting and subscribing. I love and appreciate every single one of you guys, and I'll be seeing you next month.